Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. We're welcoming back Jane and John today because we love a part two on this show and we felt like we'd barely skimmed the surface last time. So thank you so much for coming back, both of you. Really appreciate
Great to be here.
We're going to skim more of Jane and John's. So have you been doing anything with a sledgehammer today, Jane?
No, nothing today. I've been planting garlic today. That's what I've been doing in my veg patch. Yeah.
All right. But did you have a dip though? No.
I did have a dip this morning. Yeah, and the temperature is now rising, so we're back. We're heading towards double figures now. So that's it's a great advance from when it was -3.
Yeah, it just sounds boring for you now, though, is it? No challenge now.
That's so easy. Is it wild garlic you're planting, Jane?
No. This is garlic. So it's been overwintering in my greenhouse, and it's now in the ground. So I'm looking forward to a year's supply of garlic.
Oh, lovely. Keep the vampires away, as they say. So I just want to say a few hellos. Who do we have here? So do say hello if you're watching, everyone. So we've got Deb here. Hey, Deb, and Jennifer. Lovely to see you. And we have got Vegan Review. That's you, Doc, isn't it? I always wonder who that is. I think that's you. We have got Jeremy the Ape is here, and Carolyn, and I think and Joanna. Yeah, hello everyone. Do say hello if you're just joining us. Good to see everyone. Oh, and Philip just joined as well from New York. Hey, Philip. And Philip's, I think, an hour different. They just put their clocks forward, I think, in New York yesterday. Is that correct, Philip? We're slightly closer in time at the moment. But good to see everyone. So, who wants to get started with...
Before we start, Wendy, let me remind to everyone watching that if they have questions from part 1, things that they want to be clarified, or they have read the book and they have things they want to ask, they can put it in the chat from the beginning, so we can go through them.
Yeah, good point.
And of course, we do have this rule that we don't go for super chats and all that malarkey, so you'll never have to pay to have your views and that put on the screen. So we don't believe in any of that capitalist rubbish. And in terms of where's best to watch this, it's on my YouTube channel. It's going out to 2 Facebook groups and my YouTube channel. So if you do comment on one of the Facebook groups, we will see it, but you won't be able to see in replies. So that's the kind of general rule on that.
Hey, excellent. So yeah, we've got a few different questions. We're trying to do different questions from last time to get through more of the book. But is there anything before we started our questions, Jane and John, that you wanted to say from last time that you didn't get to say, or that
we were going to ask about you've been out and about with your book. So how is that going?
It's gone really, really well, actually. I think we've done 4 in-person events now. 2 of them were at bookshops. We had over 50 people at each of those. And then we've been down St Leonard's on the south coast. I think we had 13 people there. And just this week, we're out in Salford at the Working Class Movement Library, and a good turnout there. And the response is really positive, to be honest with you. It's really interesting because we've had academics, and then we've had activists in the panel discussing the book. And what's interesting is the book seems to manage to speak to people across the spectrum from whichever aspect of the movement they're starting from. So I'm sure there's lots of people who don't like the book. We just haven't met them yet.
But that's what we intended to do with the book. We wanted it to speak to a widest range of people possible. So we didn't want to make it too academic-y, but we wanted enough academic stuff in there that people could actually go and read other material or look at it in, from different angles. So it seems to be working. But like John said, we've only met people who like it so far, which is great.
Oh, that's brilliant. So what kind of people are coming, and what kind of questions are you getting after the talks and things?
Well, for example, in Nottingham, we had we had a panel. So basically, we talked for 10 minutes, just doing an outline, and then people who've read the book just discuss it and their experience of reading the book. So Nottingham, we had someone from the LGBTQ community. We had people from a group called Veggies, which, Roger, you'll remember, still going. So they're a sort of anarchist, vegan, animal rights community group. We had someone from the local trades council, a trade unionist, and I can't remember who the fourth panelists were. But so it was a really broad range. We've tended to have people from trade union backgrounds. We've had people from feminist movement, people from the Black race equality movement. So a bit of a mix of panelists, really. And as I say, a couple of academics have participated as well.
I think it was interesting. We had it reviewed as well by an academic who interviewed us in a similar format to this. And, you know, one of his concerns was that he hoped he's not read too widely by the other side. So that was quite an interesting take on it.
What, you like tipping them off?
Indeed. Yeah.
We may come back to that issue about, you know, repeating the same things and expecting the same results, because it doesn't always work.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that you've wrote about in the book, obviously. Going back to Veggies, John, do you remember when they introduced their vegan-friendly Mars bar? Do you remember that?
I don't.
I think that was around the Hillgrove time, so that might be a little bit late for you, but
Yeah.
they were incredibly popular, as you can imagine. Right, who's going to set us off then?
Yeah, who wants to go first?
I'll
You
go
do.
first. Because
Yeah.
Nelly, you go first.
Laura,
my question is from an early chapter. That's why I think it's chapter 4, mobilizing and organizing. And of that chapter, you mentioned these are two distinct things that we need both in the movement, and that it's important to know the difference between the two. So, would you like to talk about it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start, really, because people often confuse the two things, mobilising and organising. And, you know, in a sense, there is a crossover between the two of them. But I think it's important from a strategic perspective to understand how they differ. So, you know, if we're talking about mobilising, we're often thinking about the way we often conceptualize it is by mobilizing those people who are already involved in some way. So the people who've already ideologically committed, you know, but also have got time to commit to, you know, coming out on demonstrations or writing letters or whatever it is that you're doing. So in a sense, you know, we can distinguish that from organizing, where we're really trying to think about, you know, how do we expand our organising approach? How do we think about the power analysis that's necessary in order to transform, you know, where we are to where we want to be? I mean, we could talk about it, you know, probably for a long time, but in a sense, it's simple to think about this as being organising as being transformational. You're trying to change your organisation in such a way that you've thought about power, you've thought about strategy, you've thought about theory and change, you've thought about leadership, and you're trying to work with your people to build your organisation. Whereas in terms of mobilising, the organisation, to a certain extent, is already there, but you're just calling on the already committed. And I think for organising, we need to move much beyond that if we are to achieve our aim. So that's a shortened version of how I would define it. But maybe John would like to add more to that.
Well, I suppose I'd just like to give an example, really. And I think, you know, at the moment, we have a real problem in this country in terms of a growth in narratives of division. Now, last year, there was a far-right protest outside a hotel that was housing asylum seekers in Rotherham. The Sheffield TUC mounted a counter-protest. They took 10 coaches, nearly 500 people, to a counter-protest. Those people got off the coaches, shouted at the far right, got back on their coaches and went home. Now, actually, if you imagine, if you'd taken 500 people into Rotherham, you could have leafleted every door in Rotherham trying to find people who also had sympathy for asylum seekers. And you could have begun to build a base of people in Rotherham who were going to organise to defeat narratives of division. So the difference is whether or not you're seeking to build your power or whether you're seeking merely to use what power you already have.
I think
It
it's clear.
seems like an incredible waste of. Mind you, don't get very far in Rotherham, though, do you, Wendy?
That's my hometown. That's where I hail from. Oh yes, always in the news for the good reasons. Yeah, no, it was just down the road from my family actually when that happened. So yeah, it was very shocking. But
so Nella, can I ask you a question back?
Yes,
so
of course.
what did you take from reading that chapter? Did you find that distinction useful in any way or not?
Yes, I did. I have to say that I tend to confuse the two, in the sense that in my mind, even when we mobilize the troops we already have, we look for ways to expand at the same time and have more people in our side. So, but the distinction is per se is useful, because it made me think that we can develop specific strategies just for organizing, apart from those we use for mobilizing, and even have distinct roles in a group or organization, and different people can do different things. So yes, I think it's useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think mobilising is part of organising, because once you've organised your troops, then you do need to mobilise them. So it is part of the process, but done on its own, without the organising, then it tends to go backwards rather than forwards, because you're not building the power that's necessary to effect change.
Yes, and it may be a little stagnant using, the same resources every time. Deb has a question about it. She asks, would call to action in specific issues be an example of mobilization? We see a lot of those in the internet.
So yeah, I mean, I think I would define it in that way. But again, it depends on whether it's part of a strategy that's been planned by the organising of your group. So it could be that it is one tool or one tactic in the whole process of your organising. So yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, let me just come in another example. One of the things that often happens in the UK is the government decides there's going to be so much cuts to the funding of local government. Local government then passes that they're going to cut so many jobs and services. And what traditionally would happen is someone would call a counter protest to lobby the council, say, don't vote for this, it's not right. And all that would happen is people would turn up, shout a bit, and often be ignored. And then, the organising approach say, look, we'll gather these people together, and then we'll say, okay, if we want to defeat these cuts, we're going to have to organise workplace by workplace and street by street, so that we get everyone who's concerned about this as part of the movement to change it. Rather than, I mean, Jane McAleese is quite rude about it. She says, well, you're just getting self-selecting activists to turn up in a very performative way and then go home again. It's almost like the easiest form of activism is to turn up to a protest. You just have to make sure you get out of bed on time, get there on time, do whatever it is, and then you go home. There's no emotional commitment. Whereas, if you say we're going to have to build power, then I'm going to have to speak to a lot of people. I'm going to have to speak to some people who disagree with me, and I'm going to have to encourage people to think that actually what they feel about this can contribute to making change. And that's a big task. And I think if we don't do the big tasks, then we're not going to get the big wins.
That's interesting. And there is a lot happening in Greece lately. Lots of people protesting and lots of people trying to, get people off their couches and go out and protest. So, yeah, what you say makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does. And actually, it ties into a question that I didn't get to ask last time in terms of something that you said in the book about not relying on tried and tested strategies. So you were just saying there about the protest being one of the easiest forms there, John. And something that happens a lot here in London, like we have a lot of kind of almost scheduled events that are very regular, which you know, you can really take your hat off to that, because it's activists getting off their bombs, getting out, and they're you know, they're proactive and they're consistent and they're committed. But I guess, you know, my question is, are scheduled events like this useful? Are they effective? Things like, it might be, there's a lot of course, vegan outreach. There might be regular protests against so-called fur outside different shops, particularly along the kind of Bond Street and places like that, where, you know, a lot of these kind of big designer shops are selling those kind of that kind of clothing, you know, that kind of thing, sort of regular and scheduled things. What's your perspective, both of you, on those kind of events and how effective they are?
I mean, I would say that I think all action is important, and it all plays a different role, and it all can help to build to, you know, to what you're trying to achieve. But I think some of it is more effective than other things. And I think, you know, we draw upon the work of Saul Alinsky, you know, in his book, Rules for Radicals, etc. And one of the things he often talks about is going beyond what your adversary expects. Because, you know, we know our opposition, they get used to what we do, and they can often just ignore what we do. But the more you go outside of what they expect, the more likely you are to create a reaction of some kind. So I think, you know, I wouldn't rule out any form of action, or most forms of action, because I think they all play a different role in some ways. But it really, when you're thinking about trying to effect change, what you're looking for is power. What power resources that we got that we can utilise can create the greatest change that we're looking to achieve. So yeah, I mean, I think all action is important, I would say.
I'll try and give another example, really, because I think one of the things we try and say in the book is there aren't black and white answers. Right? So mobilise and organise are two distinct concepts, but it doesn't mean one's bad and the other one's always right. And so in terms of, you know, these long-term, almost ritualised protests, I remember years and years ago, in the early 80s, when Coordinated Animal Welfare was trying to take over the BUAV and trying to create a more radical movement, a more determined abolitionist movement, compared to the sort of softly approach the BUAV had been taking for many years. And Angela Warder, who was one of the leading thinkers, said, look, I am fed up with having people come together once a month for a meeting to discuss what ought to be done. We have to be doing something at the same time. I know that our aspiration is to take the resources of this big organisation and democratise it and make it a tool for the movement. But if all we ever do is talk until we get there, it's going to be destructive. And so she suggested, and people agreed, to start a weekly protest at Club Row, opposite the market, where they were selling pet animals, and where the people supplying stolen dogs for vivisection would go down, they'd take a dog on a lead and they'd sell it and so on. And we spent years doing that. And the police were really hostile. There was lots of people who got arrested for minor public order offences and so on. But it was actually quite an important thing to do at that time, because it was the first time outside of Sabin that there was a public protest on a regular basis against a particular form of animal abuse. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that when you say, right, we're going to do this once a week forever, it's unlikely that all of the factors in play are going to come to the same balance in 2 years' time as they do today. So it may well be the right thing to do today, but unless you're working out what impact are we having, what other things could we be doing which might have greater impact, then I think you're just in a rut. That doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing, but unless you're thinking about it, then you're probably not optimizing the bang for your protest buck.
Because I suppose things like you were saying, Jane, people get used to it, and I suppose then it becomes absorbed into the system in a way, because the system then adapts around what you're doing, and then it just becomes business as usual. And so then you're not creating that resistance in a way that although I sometimes think the presence of the resistance is important, that even if people are just seeing that there's opposition to something going on, I always feel like it's something that makes people realize actually not everyone is all right about this, and that might just plant a seed and go, what is it that they don't like about this? So I do feel that's important, but I can see why it could become very absorbed. Can I just ask, do you mind if I ask a follow-up question on this, actually?
No,
Can I just come in? Can I just come in?
Oh, yeah,
before
please
you
do,
because
John.
I was just having a thing there. You know, when we get to win, it's often because we've caused a crisis that the other side cannot carry on as they have been because it's no longer working for them. And I just think if you think about how is this action going to create a situation where the other side cannot continue as they always have, then once something's become ritualized, it's almost very, very unlikely that it's going to create that crisis. So that I suppose that's a bit I wanted to add in, but.
Yeah, I mean, and I would add in something else, another example, you know, the protest, the ongoing protest outside the South African embassy during apartheid was incredibly important. I mean, you know, it was there all the time. It was incredibly important in terms of constantly highlighting what was going on in South Africa. But in and of itself, that wasn't going to change apartheid. But it doesn't mean that it didn't play an important role. So, but you constantly have to balance. You have to think about what resources you have, what is taking up the most of your time and energy, and whether actually that's having the effect that you want it to have.
And then just a follow-up question, because all of this, often the kind of things that I'm talking about in terms of the protests and things like that will be, a lot of them, apart from maybe the vegan outreach, but a lot of them are maybe what we'd call single issue campaigns and protests. And in the book you talk a lot about, in your chapter 5 around equality, you talk about a lot about the interconnection of oppressions and how we have to realize that actually nothing is a single issue. And there was a beautiful quote from Audre Lorde, which I don't have to hand because my iPad kind of just run out, but there was a beautiful quote.
Audre Lorde said there are no single issues because we don't live single issue lives.
That was the one. Yeah, I love that. And I just wonder again, in terms of the effectiveness of this kind of single issue protest, again, are they still important, the fact that they're here and the fact that they can create this visual resistance and a part of the tapestry, perhaps? Are they still important in that way, or are they perhaps less important because they don't address the interconnectedness of oppressions and the entanglement of everything that's going on? You know, I just wonder what your views are on single issue campaigns and protests, really, I guess, in the animal movement specifically.
I mean, if you think, you know, a protest against vivisection, then you know, that's fine. But if people want to win, then they probably need to understand, why is it that vivisection continues? You know, why is it that this failed science continues? Why is so much money? Why is the government prepared to invest the sort of money and legitimacy in destroying a group like Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty? You know, why is that going on? And if you don't ask yourself that question, you're unlikely to find a realistic strategy to win. I mean, a lot of people, don't mean to be rude, but a lot of people find themselves in a situation where they're happy enough simply to protest. They're so angry about something that at least doing something is enough. And personally, I think this is the key thing about the books, and actually we can win, but we can only win if we were constantly strategic, reviewing what we're doing, thinking about the power the other side has, thinking about how we can reduce their power, thinking how we can build the power of our side. And that's why I think that intersectionality is so very important, because you have to have a worldview about why this particular abuse is sustained.
But I also think that, you know, in order to be able to focus, we need the single issue sometime. We need to say, this is what's making us angry or upset at a particular time. This is something that needs to change. But I think, you know, what's important in any campaign is how we link that to what's going on in wider society as well. So it's why one of the things I think we talk about in the book as well is the importance of political education. And again, I mean that in a, you know, small p, not party political. It's about how you educate people within your organisations to see the links between that particular issue that brought them into the campaign and how that connects to wider issues as well. So I think it's part of a dynamic process that's taking place all the time. But I think we need the single issues in order to attract people to what is going on, things that's, you know, having an emotional resonance with them that makes them want to act. We connect with that, and then we build upon that process as part of the campaigns.
I'd just like to come in on that. I mean, you know, one of the most powerful things that happened when I was young was when I'm not going to mention his name. I think everyone knows who it was. This animal liberationist broke into ICI's laboratories and rescued the smoking beagles. Right? Now, the smoking beagles had already been a difficulty for the vivisection industry, because actually, if you choose to smoke, you know that it's a danger to your health. That's your choice. Why on earth should animals be subject to this appalling abuse in the vain hope of finding some kind of treatment? But what happened when those dogs were out was there was a huge emotional response from the public, thinking, I'm so pleased somebody's done that. And, you know, it was a avenue into understanding animal cruelty for a lot of people. So sometimes a particular issue, as Jane is saying, it can be the door through which people come into the movement. But if you compartmentalize all the issues within the movement, then I think you're making it harder to win.
Really good points. Actually, in hello, Alan, Vegan Island Radio. Alan's going to be coming on to talk about anti-vivisection actually in a few weeks' time. And he's saying, I take single issues to be a place where interconnectedness can be explained. So that's kind of...
that's a great way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, looking forward to that show as well. And I think really interesting, this whole coming onto the anti-vivisection thing, it sometimes feels like you're talking about gaining power, and how do we gain power? How do we build our side and make things untenable for the other side? And sometimes it feels so impossible, especially with something like so-called animal research testing and all that. And it just feels like that, because obviously when I came into the movement, that was like a massive part of the movement, anti-vivisection, which is now not so much, but it used to be. And there was a lot of focus on that. And of course there was a lot of direct action, there were a lot of arrests, there were a lot of people serving sentences, there were a lot of legal changes, and a lot of kind of restrictions being placed then, and you know, injunctions and all that kind of thing. So the landscape's massively changed around that. And now it feels like it's even harder to somehow get into those gaps, or to find a place where you can, yeah, kind of infiltrate this massive industry and establishment.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, because it was the same when I came into the animal rights movement. You know, vivisection was the thing. I think we've seen a switch to veganism or plant-based being the thing in terms of the focus. And, you know, I don't know why, maybe you know much better than I do as to why there's not the same sort of focus on vivisection as there was in the past. I mean, is it because it's more difficult to get behind what's actually taking place in laboratories? Is it the arguments are more difficult to explain to people? Is it, I don't know.
All of the above, I think, Jane,
yeah,
and many more. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I would contribute a question, because I don't know enough to say one way or the other. But when you look at groups like Stop Hunting and Animal Cruelty, they really, really mobilized. They really mobilized. And, you know, they were disrupting this horrible company's business all over the world. You know, it's an incredible example. And I think Ronnie discusses this at some stage in his book, where he says, you know, there was a point at which we realised we'd been naive because we kind of thought actually it was us against the vivisectors. He said, and we didn't even consider that the state would take action to stop us winning. And if you look at what happened with Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, there were laws that were made up specifically to jail people involved in that campaign. If they'd been doing the same protests about something else, they could not have been jailed because it wasn't a criminal offence to do those things in relation to other campaigns, only to animal vivisection. Of course, what we've seen is the law has now moved on, and we're seeing people jailed for very long periods of time for environmental protests and so on. But I think coming back to the issue of vivisection is, I think there was a possibility that mounting that amount of pressure without sufficient public support, so that when the backlash came from the state, it was possible, it wasn't easy, but it was possible for the state simply to smash those people, and there wasn't a public outrage to it that there should have been. But I'm not close enough to be able to make those full judgments. So I think it's part of the analysis that needs to be done.
Very interesting, yeah.
Right.
Deb's asking, is there a tactic that you think should never be used?
Yes.
Oh, well, we were discussing this before you came on, so it might be a good segue. But I just think violence has no place in our movement. The difference between self-defense, if you're out sabotaging a hunt and they attack you with big sticks and stuff, then, you know, fight your way out of it. But premeditated violence, I think, is utterly counterproductive and has been very, very damaging to the animal movement.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Well, I've got a question that touches on that a little later. Do you want to tackle this one from Deb? The idea about social media and conventional mass media. I mean, this is kind of my area, but what's your take on this?
Do you think it's important for mainstream media? So I'm not quite sure I quite understand the question. Has social media? Okay, so I tell you what I think about social media is it's very useful for mobilising your supporters, right? If you've got a WhatsApp group, say everybody turn up at 6 o'clock and we're going to have a flash mob, right? Brilliant. Actually, if you want to influence people, there's a lot of the far right use Facebook and whatever the other one, Twitter. But actually, psychologically, it's a lot easier to be frightened and scared on social media than it is to become hopeful and optimistic. And so people have tried to counter the forces of division by investing in social media. I don't think it really works. You can use social media to mobilize your existing people. If you want to engage with the wider community, you're going to have to get out on the street, on the knocker, and speak to people face to face, because when you build a relationship where you're speaking to someone who thinks, okay, this is another human being, it's far easier to get them to lower their guard a little bit and to discuss issues that they may be uncomfortable with. If you try and do that by just blasting people on social media, I tend to think you're wasting your money.
I also think that we shouldn't underestimate still the importance of mainstream media. I mean, I think both are really important, but mainstream media has a different impact in different circles. So only last night I was watching the programme that's been released in the UK in the last week about spy cops and the influence they had on infiltrating social justice movements, and particularly the relationships they had with women, and that was all, anyway, really, really horrible. And I think one of the things that's really helped to highlight that was the fact it was picked up by the mainstream media. It was all over social media before that, but it was only when the investigative journalists really started to dig that it actually had an impact. And then it had an impact that the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, decided to have an inquiry into what was happening into undercover policing, into social movements. I don't believe that would have happened because of social media. I think it would have just been allowed to just run. But the fact that it was actually being investigated by mainstream journalists, investigative journalists, had the impact that it did. So I think they both play a role, but I think they have a different impact on a different audience.
Do you think that we should also consider who owns mainstream media? Because usually the information that is broadcasted is controlled more or less by governments or the magnates around those that govern. And sometimes, very often actually, at least in this area of the world, it takes social media in order to push a journalist to do their job and actually investigate some topics, especially those relating to human rights, for example. And also that grassroots have access to social media, along with far-right groups and everyone else, but at least they have access to a large audience, whilst they do not have access to mainstream media, and they do not have their saying there. What do you think?
I don't know.
I think it's absolutely clear. Of course, the mainstream media has always been. I mean, Roger will understand this terminology. Gramsci's concept of dominant narratives is that the mainstream media tends to reflect back a view that the world as it is how it should be. That's always, that's its default position. And so seeking to effect change is, you will be, challenged by the mainstream, well, that's unrealistic, or, you're not taking everything into account and so on. So yeah, there has to be alternative channels of communication. And I think personally, when we talk about the narratives of division and the crisis that's taking place in our politics at the moment, one of the reasons that's happening is because working class communities don't have sufficient networks. I'm not talking necessarily about social media, but just human interaction between people, so that people have a story of us, a sense of this is, that's what they say, but we would expect them to say that because they're representing certain people. But in our community, we know, right? That's the sort of thing that used to happen in the 60s and 70s. There was a strong sense of working class identity. That's been greatly weakened by a number of factors.
We were talking about that, weren't we, Nella and Wendy, yesterday? I was saying that if sociologists used to say, around kind of like a Heath Wilson type thing, if they asked somebody, what are you? They might answer, I'm working class. You'd never get that answer now. It'd be much more personalized, individualistic, neoliberal, and all that kind of stuff. Now, we've moved on really quickly. I wanted to say, I remember Club Row Must Go, but also here's a little treat for you, John. It's only a few seconds, I think.
Obviously, they were in a very distressed condition. They were very shy, terrified. They had none of the normal reactions of a dog. I went into the actual laboratory and removed 2 of the smoking beagles, and I was subsequently apprehended by the police and questioned as to the whereabouts of these dogs. By then, of course, I'd passed them on. They'd gone to safe homes, and the police, they made a great deal of the fact that the dogs were almost certain to die once they'd been released from the laboratory and from the sterile conditions. But we refused to hand the dogs back, and it actually has now transpired that they've spent some 3 years at least, leading a perfectly happy and normal existence.
It's always nice to see liberated our fellow animals out there. Before we move on then, maybe this one also feeds into the vivisection thing, in the sense that, and I think also that the arguments about vaccines and COVID were problematic within the movement as well. And so I think we've now got quite a few people in the modern vegan movement, let's call it, who are not necessarily pro-vivisection, but they don't know much about it, but also they're aware that they're using products which come from labs, and then don't quite know how to navigate that as an issue, I think. And Jonah Well here was talking about lab meat. There's quite a lot of support for that within the movement, and then there's arguments about to what extent have those gone through the vivisection laboratories. So I think the vivisection argument within the vegan community has become a bit more complicated than it used to be when we were all just against it, I suppose. Whereas now there's nuances to it, I think.
Shall I come in on lab meat? I'm just completely I just cannot comprehend how there can be an industry trying to grow meat in laboratories. What is it about meat that people want, distinct from vegan cereals, pulses, and everything like that? I mean, one of the things we always used to say was, look, what people would say, why are you vegan? Is it for health reasons? Is it for environmental reasons? Is it for animal cruelty reasons? We would go, no, all of the above. Right? The idea that people would want to give up farmed meat and start eating this lab-grown meat, I just can't see the logical progression. I have to say, by the way, I suspect that if meat was grown from cells in labs, then it would be less cruel than it is farming animals on farms, but and the process of the slaughterhouse and all that. But I just don't understand individually why someone would not simply make the choice. I don't want to be part of that process of cruelty, therefore I'm going to go vegan.
Yeah, I sort of wondered, how much we've moved away from that sort of general animal rights philosophy about living without cruelty in its broadest sense, it covering all aspects of animal cruelty. It seems to me that we're much more compartmentalized now, that people are either, vegan, plant-based, but the disconnect between other aspects, either factory farming or vivisection, seem to be disconnected. I don't know. I'm not as involved in the animal rights movement as I was in the past, but I just seem to get that sense that there isn't that holistic approach taken to. I mean, I know there is with individuals, but I mean in a more societal sense that there isn't that overall arching philosophy of living without cruelty. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, as I said, it's a bit complicated. One nuanced thing about so-called lab meat is if you want to create controversy within the vegan community, you could talk about not feeding so-called pets, animal companions, flesh. That creates all kinds of upset, and so people have said, well, lab meat might come in fairly useful in that sense, but that's just one kind of niche area. Anyway, I want to ask my question. It's quarter already now. I gave you prior warning to this, Jane and John, because you say in your book that it's both a tribute and a reaction to Alinsky, which you've mentioned already, Sol Alinsky, and you mentioned two books, Rules for Radicals, which, when you think about it, that's a pretty good title, isn't it? It really kind of it's kind of almost clickbait kind of title. But you said that you also thought that Reveille for Radicals was more interesting. And then you've got this quote in this section, which really kind of spoke to me, kind of got me right in my microphone here. I was going to bash my heart, but I better not. And it said, the real magic happens when new generations of organizers interpret what has been gifted to them by history and then go beyond those principles to create something genuinely new. Now, if only that could happen within the vegan movement, it would be marvelous. But there's all kinds of like resistance to that. But I just wondered whether to kind of situate your book in the kind of run of books like this, that you maybe just to elaborate on this use of Alinsky and, his kind of movement reflexivity, evolution of ideas, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, I'll start off with Rules for Radicals then. I mean, I think we've all learned, anybody who's read Saul Alinsky's probably learned a lot from his books and from Rules for Radicals. And I don't dispute that it was a really important book to highlight organising, different organising approaches, tactics to use, and giving people a framework in which to think about how they organise their social movement, whatever that was at the time. But I think what we try and do in our book is to say that having that basis understanding of rules and tactics can be useful. But actually, you have to always think about the social, political, economic environment that you operate in at any particular time, because that changes. Our adversaries change constantly. They adapt to the tactics that we use. So if you get stuck in following a set of rules, then actually your chances of winning are likely to be diminished because your adversary understands what's expected. It's like I said at the start, going beyond the expectations of your adversary. What worked, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, or even 5 years ago, might not work today. So you've always got to consider how you change your tactics, how you adapt your tactics, how you bring in different people with different ideas. And I think that's our critique of Alinsky. Like we say, we don't dispute the fact that he had an important role to play in educating people about how to organise social movements, but it was limited. And we don't think there are a set of rules. There are some principles, there's some ideas, but actually it's about how you change those according to the social, political, and economic circumstances of any particular time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what I would say is, Saul Alinsky isn't the problem. The problem is the people who read Saul Alinsky's book and think, I have all the answers now, right? Saul Alinsky wrote that book before most people had a domestic telephone, let alone a fax machine or a mobile phone or the internet, right? The world has moved on, and the right answer to any situation depends on the balance of forces, and the balance of forces are always shifting. So there isn't a blueprint written by someone 70 years ago that's going to solve all our problems. There's no holy grail. There's no text that someone has written down all the answers, and you just have to find that text and then use it. One of the problems with Alinsky is that, however good he was, people think, I'm going to use the Alinsky method. And then rather than judging their campaign against what impact it's having, they start judging it against Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. We must be doing well because we're following Alinsky's rules, right? Actually, you're either doing well or you're not, whatever's going on. So I think that's a problem. And I'll just give you just one example that comes to mind. If you think about the African-American civil rights movement, it really, its roots are very much in the 1940s, when Ella Baker was a national organizer for the what was called the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. And that organization spent a lot of its time funding legal challenges to what we would call apartheid, right? The racial segregation, the Jim Crow laws of the American South in particular. And one of the things they managed to win in the court of law was that segregation in national context was unlawful, unconstitutional. Now that gave the impetus for groups like the boycott, the Montgomery boycott, was based on the fact that this high Supreme Court had found segregation unlawful in certain circumstances. And we all know how massive the impact of that was. But you go beyond that a few years later, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee suddenly discovers this new tactic of the sit-in. They've got a counter service in a restaurant. It says whites only. So you're black and you go in, you sit at the counter, you wait to get served. And they call the police and people throw things at you and stuff like that. And the next day you come back and there's more of you. And this was absolutely transformational. But no one had written a book. And if they'd done the sit-ins in the 40s rather than in the late 60s, they would not have had the same effect. It would not have caught the mood, and they would not have had the vast numbers of people involved. So the idea that there's a blueprint doesn't work for us. And I think really what we try and do in the book is say, look, there is so much we can learn from what other people have done and the context in which it's happened and so on. But actually, we're going to have to make our own history in the context in which we find ourselves, using the insights that other people have had, but applying them in new circumstances.
Yeah, thanks for that. So it should be called Ideas for Radicals, really, shouldn't it?
Probably.
I have to tell you, it's a secret, so don't tell anyone else, that we came under quite a lot of pressure from the publishers to have the word radical in the book title. I said it has to have radical in the book title because it'll sell more if it's got radical. And there comes a point when you make some compromises, and it didn't seem like the worst compromise we've ever made. So,
What you mean? They wanted it in the main title and not the subtitle, or
no, they wanted it in the subtitle.
oh, they're
Just
okay in this. Okay,
yeah.
Right, I'm with you. Right, what's next, folks?
I had one last.
Go ahead, Wendy. Go ahead. We may have the same one.
Oh no, well, I don't know if it is because mine was.
Well, you can do it together and find out.
Mine was to do with the equality and leadership concept that you talk about in the book. So you have a chapter on equality, and then the following chapter is all about strong leadership. And I just wonder if you might just say a little about how these two things can maybe sit side by side, and especially in relation to the animal rights movement, of how you maybe see that working. Like, how do we introduce equality and have that as an important part of our organising, but also develop strong leadership, and could you define leadership for us as you understand it as well? I know you gave different examples of different types of leadership, so I just wondered if you might say a little bit about that.
Go ahead, John. So you're just about to speak. Yeah, go on.
Okay, so leadership is traditionally conceived as someone very clever being at the front telling everybody else what to do. We don't follow that vision of leadership. And I think in the book, we take a lot of learning from our time in the hunt saboteur movement, where a hunt saboteur group tended not to have a specific leader who did all the thinking for everybody else. People had to develop their own tactical judgment. I mean, one of the first things that would happen you join a hunt saboteur group, people would talk to you a lot about the what animals would do when they were being hunted, what were believed to be the appropriate tactics, in the certain knowledge that at some stage or other you were going to be on your own. The hare or the fox was going to go legging past you. The hunt was going to be not far behind, and it was your job to make the right decision in that moment that was going to save that animal, right? So that's leadership, having that ability to make strategic judgments in the heat of the moment. Now, the question is, how do we gel all this together? Because obviously, we want a movement that moves collectively. And so the leadership is about developing people's capacity at every level in the movement to make those strategic decisions. And by having this is where the equality issue comes in, having the widest diversity of lived experience involved in those discussions. So people, when you're talking about trying to make change, you bring the whole of your lived experience into that discussion. If all you have, just for argument's sake, is a group of old white men having a discussion, that's not going to be as rich a discussion as you have a group that's diverse in terms of age, ethnicity, gender, etc. Because you've got more information flowing in, and that gives you the possibility of finding new and innovative solutions. So I think you use the term strong leadership, and I kind of bristle a little bit at that. We need good leadership, but we need devolved and shared leadership where everybody's actually contributing the maximum that they can in terms of developing their capacity to make strategic judgments and to share that with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think all that I would add to that is that a lot of my research focus over the last sort of 20 years or so has been on trade unions and also a focus on leadership within trade unions. And until very recently, most trade unions in the UK have been run by elderly white men. And, there is a sense that, and what's happened over the last few years is that there have been some smaller independent unions that have developed in the UK. And they've mainly been from groups of migrant workers. And they're organised very, very differently in terms of their leadership, but also the way that their organisations run. And I think that stems from the fact that they have a leadership from a diverse background.
Sorry, Jane, can I just interrupt you?
Yes.
There's an echo come on. Has somebody done something different? Did somebody do something there's a very strong echo?
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear it as well.
I can hear it too.
It's stopped now that Roger's put himself on mute.
Stop now. Yeah, that's true.
Right. Okay.
Okay, I'll come back on. And is it back again?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, that's weird. It must be me then. That's odd.
Don't know. So I mean, basically, what I was trying to talk about was distributive leadership and drawing upon the different lived experiences of a much broader lived experience in leadership. And I think that makes a difference to the way an organisation thinks, but it's also the way it behaves as well, and its level of inclusivity. I think if you have a leadership like the trade union movement had for many, many decades, then you miss out on, the building of different ideas, different experiences, and the impact that has upon organisations, again, in terms of strategy and tactics.
I love that. And actually in the book you say, to quote you, unfortunately in social movements too often we replicate the hierarchies we seek to dismantle.
Yeah,
that's really interesting as well, isn't it? Could you maybe say a little bit more about that and how you see that playing out maybe in our movement?
Well, I mean, again, the only examples that I can draw upon that I've had particular experience of do come from the trade union movement, and I was mentioning the new trade unions, the independent trade unions in the UK that are made up of largely migrant workers. And what you're seeing in these is collective decision making in a way that you don't see in quite the same way in trade unions, because there's so many hierarchies. This is much more distributive, where people have a greater chance to have an impact, and it really affects the type of strategies and tactics that people use within their organisations. And I don't think you get that when you have a highly structured organisation at different levels that makes it difficult for people from different identities and backgrounds to rise through that leadership position.
Yeah, I'd like to just come in on this as well. And we talked earlier about single issue campaigns. I think the other side of that.
Sorry, it's Brian's alarm.
The other side of that is a question of intersectionality, isn't it? It seems, in my experience, that if you want your group or your organisation to genuinely represent wider society in all its diversity, then you're going to have to make some specific efforts to do that. If you just say, well, anyone who's interested can come along, then you're likely to find that the group of people who come along actually are not going to be particularly diverse. And so actually part of your planning needs to be seeing who are the different groups that we need to get into this room to make this a powerful group. Okay, so let's think about different people in terms of ethnicity, let's think about age, let's think about job occupations, etc. And once you start thinking in that way, it's actually relatively easy to do it. But unless you think in that way, then it's not going to happen of its own. And once you start thinking in that way, you begin to create a culture where people think, wow, this is really interesting. This is an exciting place to be. There's a lot of energy in the room. A friend of ours came to a conference we organised 2 years ago. It was on union organising. And he's in his 50s. And he's a guy from an Asian background. He said, look, you know, it was just amazing walking into that room and realizing, first of all, I wasn't the only black face in the room, and secondly, I wasn't amongst the younger generation in there. And once people get that excitement, they start telling other people, you know, you should be getting along. There's something happening here. And I think coming back to the whole organising, mobilising thing, actually one of the things we all need is that sense of energy when we're involved in something. That actually there's a lot of energy in this room. We can maybe do something with that energy. If you just go along to some meetings, I've been along to meetings sometimes, you sit there and you just say, oh my God, I wish I'd stayed at home. You know, there is no energy in the room. There's just people are going through ritualised discussions and disagreements. So yeah, get the energy in the room, make sure you organise for equality.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't hope for diversity in your membership. You have to make it happen. And I think that's a mistake that often organisations make, that they think that it will just happen at some point, but it doesn't. You have to actually make it happen.
Well, here's interesting. Is the echo back or not?
No, you're all right.
Okay, right, I'll turn myself down a little bit in terms of the speaker. Going back to the leader thing, it's interesting because sociologists tend to use the phrase prime mover, but it's a little bit pedantic and kind of as well. But it does get around the problem of the word leader. Now, in terms of diversity, what we get in at the moment in the animal movement, the animal advocacy movement, is the idea that we should be welcoming people from the far right and even fascists, because as a kind of example of diversity, because we can all unite for the animals and then leave all the politics to one side. And so where would you go with that?
No.
Yeah.
There's going to be a fight in that meeting, isn't there? I mean, let's be absolutely clear. We talked earlier about intersectionality, right?
But they reject that. We've got to remember that they actually are anti-intersectionality, and so because of this reason, that it's kind of like, oh, you've cancelled the far right.
Yeah, but if we're talking about building the strongest movement we can, whatever that movement might be, then if you're going to start excluding people, and I'm talking about the far right excluding people, because they will start off with the ethnic minorities, people with dark skin, lesbians, gays, transgender, and we just carry on until there's white men left.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, that's the bit that they don't ever get, because if you say, well, you're asking for a coalition or an alliance with people who would see themselves as oppressed and you as the oppressor, guess what? The next meeting they're not going to turn up. But they don't get that. They don't really get that argument.
Yeah.
I find it really odd, Roger. I mean, because let's be honest, the far right have constantly tried to infiltrate the animal rights movement over the years, from the early hunt saboteurs onwards. Really, I remember
Patrick Moore and all that. Yeah,
I remember. Oh God, I forgot Patrick Moore. Oh dear, that's going back. Anyway, I remember there was an AGM of the hunt saboteurs in London, and there'd been this group that, I mean, we're not talking about people who just don't like people who's with different immigration. We're talking about people who are organising physical attacks on people from ethnic minorities. And some of them are joining the hunt saboteurs, right? And there was a discussion at hunt saboteurs, the AGM. There wasn't one person who said, oh no, we need them because they're for the animals. Like it was intuitive. We're a rights-based movement. We're not. We don't want these people anywhere near us.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think one of the reasons that they are keen to get involved is because they want to create division, between people, and that's the only purpose of their involvement. It's not that they're really concerned about the issues.
Yeah, so very true. Just going back to the whole leadership thing. What I loved about what you said, actually, which just really got me thinking differently about leadership, because at first I was thinking, how can equality and leadership, how do they go together, like especially with that more kind of anarchic thinking. But actually I love what you said about leadership is enabling others to achieve, and it's about giving other people permission to act and kind of creating the environment that people can do kind of empowerment in a way, and people are empowered to make decisions and take action. And then there was also, you also talked about leadership is about being a learner. So someone who's learned to ask the right questions. So you're saying a leader doesn't have to be a knower who knows all the answers, but a leader has to be someone who has learned to ask the right questions, and then that is kind of a very good practice for good leadership. And I really love that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the best leaders are the enablers, the people who can enable other people to achieve their potential, or to develop those people to achieve their potential. I think that's, for me, that's what a good leader is about. It's not the person who's a positional leader, who stands at the front, has the ideas, is the figurehead. I think the best leaders that I've ever come across in whatever movement that I've been involved in are the enablers, because that's what helps to build our movements to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were probably paraphrasing Marshall Gans, but one of the things he talks about leadership, he talks about, you know, empowering others and taking responsibility. He said, in a time of uncertainty, that's the key thing to understand is, and we sometimes distinguish between leadership and management, right? Now, management is a simple process. If we've got a plan, we just need to make sure everybody follows it. That's not leadership. Leadership takes place when something happens that you have to react to, you have to change, you have to evolve. And I think that's really important to understand that part of the process is recognizing we don't know all the answers in advance, because as we move forward, things will change. The very presence of our movement will create the other side to change and evolve, and we have to evolve in response. The other thing I want to say, just in terms of, I mean, you're talking about leadership, but I mean, part of my experience as an educator, I worked for a trade union one time, and I was involved in this organising team where they put in the education response. And I was preparing some educational materials, and one of my colleagues said to me, these materials are really great, because if I train using these, I don't have to pretend I know all the answers. I just have to say, these are the questions we're going to have to explore, and surface the knowledge of the people in the room. Whereas too often, educators are expected to be all-knowing, and they have to pretend to be all-knowing because nobody is. They have to pretend to be all-knowing, and their word can't be challenged. Whereas real education takes place when we start thinking about the issues, looking at it from a different angle, and so on. And I think that link between leadership and education is very, very important. It is a process of supporting others to develop their capacity.
I think you know, politicians could learn a lot about this from this, actually, from what you're saying, because, you know, and it just makes me think about how you said, you know, people are expected to have all the answers, and that also leads to that situation where people are not allowed not to know. People are not allowed to say, I don't know. And then no one's allowed to make a mistake. And people expect their leaders to have all the answers, like the politicians, like you know, in the UK, the Prime Minister. And during COVID, it was quite clear no one had the answers because no one had been in that situation before. And yet they stood there. Yes, we know what we're doing. We have all the answers. This is what's going to happen. And then people kind of thought that was the truth, and that was the way it is. And it just creates this very disempowered and looking to someone to give all the answers, and this kind of this whole savior kind of situation. And yeah, it's very disempowering, I think, for most people.
I love the idea that politicians can learn. Now we're over time, but Nella, do you want to maybe finish it off with one last question?
Yes, please. A quick question. At the very end of the book, you mentioned that the building blocks of community and solidarity are the spaces we share. And I wanted to ask you, how does this play in an era and in a movement where most of the spaces we share are virtual? Can this sharing be as effective or there is something about physical proximity that cannot be replaced?
Okay, I'm going to come back to the point we made earlier that actually this is not yes or no answers, but I do think having physical spaces where people meet and interact is very, very, very important to building a sense of trust between people. Like I can see you on here and we can exchange and so on. I think, oh, you seem very nice, right? Actually, if we've sat down and had a chat, I may well think, oh, that person is someone I could trust, right? But I think that trust is far more likely to evolve in a genuine in-person meeting. I also think you get a lot more energy in in-person meetings than you get on events like this. So I think one of the things that I'm not sure if we talk about at the end of the book or not, but one of the things we talk about a lot outside the book is that a lot of the traditional spaces that were very important in the past have disappeared. So we used to, you know, my dad worked at the same factory as Roger did, right? There were 50,000 people who worked in that factory. Now, there was a commonality about people who worked. It didn't mean they all liked each other, but it certainly meant people had a shared experience. There were community events that took place where people had a sense of us that came out of having shared experience. Now, a lot of the community spaces have been sold off over the years, and actually everyone's expected to sit at home and watch television or, you know, invite people around for a drink. Actually, you know, the number of pubs that exist. I mean, when I was growing up, you'd go to the pub, you'd have a pint. If you had a problem, someone said, well, go and have a word with so-and-so, right? Buy him a pint and he'll tell you what to do about that, right? And there was this intergenerational learning that took place. Now that's gone. Now there's a really good book called, I can't remember, John Yates's book called Fractured, in which he talks about the way all of these points of connection have been thrown up in the air over the last 20, 30 years. And he says, if you look back at history, what happens regularly is when that happens, people have to create new rituals, new opportunities to bring people together. Actually, there may be a nominal reason for people coming together, but in reality, the reason is because there's value in people coming together, and we have to create new rituals to create those opportunities. So yeah, I think we need to meet in person.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, you know, compassion and understanding is much greater when we're face to face. It's easy to be rude, to be abrupt, to be dismissive when you don't know that person and they're just a face on a screen, or not even that. They just don't, you know, they're just somewhere in the ether. Whereas when you're actually face to face with someone, even when you disagree with someone, when they're face to face with you, there's much stronger levels of understanding and compassion.
Don't you think that's a bit tragic though, Jane? Because I mean, we've got this instant global communication system which we're on right now, and yet we're saying that face to face is better. And you made that point last week, and it's in the book, and I agree with it. But it's kind of a bit tragic in a way, because if it wasn't so, things could, you know, I mean, for example, diversity. You could bring in people from all over the world, you know, into your living room, but it's not as good as being down the pub, getting a pint off John.
Yeah, well, it doesn't need to be down the pub. It just needs to be, you know, community spaces that we can operate. But I mean, the other side of that is, you know, when we started the Ella Baker School of Organising, and we had to switch to online during COVID when we were all in lockdown, we had the most amazing, diverse meetings, and people had a wonderful time in the breakout groups, because the thing they said to us, I would never, ever have been in the room with these people had it not been for this being online. I just would never have come across them, because I would never have, those social circles just do not exist. So it was actually fascinating, and people learned an awful lot from that. So I'm not saying that, you know, this doesn't work at times, and it does work, but actually when we're building long-standing, you know, relationships which help us to build our movements, then actually that level of compassion and understanding that we get from face to face is you know, is really important.
Yeah, I just had one final point. Is, of course, if you've met people face to face, you've got that trust, and then you can have a discussion like this one, in which the trust is already there. So it's not an either or. It is the fact, and you know, you can build trust over these sort of things, but it's just harder. That's all.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, it's a shame though, isn't it? But still, if things were easy, we'd only be bored, wouldn't we? So
No.
If things were easy, we would have won by now.
yeah, no. Do you remember back in the early 80s, Jane and John, we actually thought, I don't know if you remember, but one of the volunteers at the BUAV said about 1982, do you know, in 10 years' time, we'll have won. And nobody thought that she was saying something ridiculous, because there was so much energy that you were saying, that face-to-face kind of, you know, comrades and all the rest of it, that we really thought it was going to happen. And, you know, nobody thought, you know, hang on a minute, you know, kind of that's a bit over the top.
Well, I think progression doesn't work in a linear fashion, does it? It's often, you know, one step forward and 10 steps back. And, you know, we just have to keep on organising, building our organisations.
Yes. Right. Well, Wendy, I suppose you've got to do some animal business.
Yep, I do. I definitely do. I'm surprised I can't hear Brian scratching at the door, telling me off. I'm sure he's somewhere telling me off.
Right. Well, it's been another fascinating hour. Thanks so much, Jane and John, for your expertise and insights and such. Another good thing in the chat as well. So
could we mention again where people can get the book from?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Give chance for Jane to wave it at people again.
Got one here.
Yeah. So where's the best place to get it then, Jane?
It's best to get it from the publisher, some Bristol University Press website. You can, of course, buy it from other places on the online stores, but it's better to buy it directly from the publisher, I think, or from your local bookstore.
I think your local bookstore is the best place.
And also go to your library and order it.
Indeed, yeah.
That's always a good one, isn't it? Right, folks.
Well, thanks very much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming on again. And thank you to everyone in the chat as well. It's been really interesting questions and comments in there as well.
Indeed, yeah. Sorry,
and we'll have you back on the 10th anniversary of the book. as we always do. So, bye for now then, folks. We'll see you again soon.
Yeah, bye, everyone.